Thank you. Thank you guys for coming so quickly after lunch. This is joint work with Josh Miller and Alexander Vostropnikov, so I just want to thank them. And it's a series of experiments that are trying to test out the implications of a model that says people are motivated by the desire to adhere to social norms. And so that what we explain as the result of prosocial preferences might be better thought of as a preference for following norms, and lots of norms happen to be prosocial. So I'm going to try to convince you of that story. I'll show you some experiments. Start with a quote from Adam Smith. He says, "A person desires not only praise, but praiseworthiness, or to be that thing which, though it should be praised by nobody, as however the natural and proper object of praise. He dreads not only blame, but blameworthiness, or to be that thing which, though it should be blamed by nobody, is however the natural and proper object of blame." So the idea is people are motivated to do actions that are consistent with norms. They avoid blame, they receive praise, and possibly even when people aren't watching. That's the other thing that's going on here, right? You dread blameworthiness. So even if people aren't paying attention, you don't want to do something that, were they paying attention, would merit being blamed for doing something wrong. So that gets at this idea that people are motivated by a desire to conform to social norms. They don't want to look bad in other people's eyes. They want to look good in other people's eyes. And how we do that is by satisfying norms. Norms are those sets of beliefs about what is the right thing to do. So I have in mind prescriptive norms, right? So what is the appropriate thing to do in a given situation? There's a set of shared beliefs about that among people, and then I want to do things that make me look good in your eyes because I follow the norm. So there's this puzzle, more or less puzzling depending on who you ask, that there's lots of cooperative and altruistic behavior in laboratory experiments. We all know this. People give money away when there's no reason to. And we tend to try to explain this in terms of preferences over the outcomes, that people have preferences for the utility of other people. So social preference models that put the distribution of payoffs into my utility. I prefer relatively equal distributions of outcomes. So on. We're going to argue instead that what's actually driving behavior is this norm-dependent preference, that people like to follow norms, and those norms often happen to have things like equal distributions of income in them. And what I think I'm going to be able to convey to you is that that's also going to help us account for some of these anomalous things where changing the choice set, changing the context in which people are giving, manipulations to the environment that don't change the set of possible outcomes but only change the context, those seem to have a big effect on people's giving. And if you take just a very simple model where I have utility over the distributions of payoffs, that kind of model can't account for the sensitivity of behavior to context. So we're going to argue that individuals care in a utility specification about their own payoff, but also about how close their action is to the normative action, to the socially appropriate thing to do. Importantly, there's going to be heterogeneity in how much people care about norms. And so that's going to drive the heterogeneity across people. So why are some people more prosocial than others? It's because some care more about norms than others. And when norms are prosocial, those people are prosocial. And so behavior in the lab is going to reflect this trade-off, the trade-off between selfishness and the desire to follow the norm. The important thing is that it's also going to let us account for context effects, because if you think about a different context as evoking a different social norm, then that's just changing which actions are considered good. So think about a dictator game where someone has earned the right to be the dictator rather than having it randomly assigned to them. We know that earning the right makes people more selfish. In ultimatum games, there's an old set of results that says, again, if you earn the right, you become more selfish. But also other people are more accepting of your unequal offers. They're less likely to reject inequality because that property right has caused them to accept inequality. And what we're saying is that property right has a whole bunch of norms associated with it. So you change the context of the game, you cause people to import a different set of beliefs about what is socially appropriate in this particular setting, and that's why their behavior changes. So the problem with this kind of explanation, I think that leads to a lot of skepticism, is that it's hard to pin down what the norm is. And so I can kind of just tell you, oh, well, they did that because that's the norm, right? And then it's also hard to measure individual norm-following preferences in a setting that's independent of other prosocial motivations. So as part of these experiments, I'm going to try to solve those two problems. One, that's really our novel contribution, I think, is to have a measure of individual differences in norm following in a setting, it's an individual choice setting divorced from any possible social preference concerns. And then we're going to use a technique developed by other people that actually allows us to empirically measure norms. So we still don't have a good theoretical foundation for where norms come from, but we have an idea of how to measure them, how to know what the norm is using experimental tasks. Okay, so one implication of thinking about it in this way, that people are trading off the desire to follow the norm in their own utility, is that if we know what the norm is, then people who care more about norms should do things more in line with the norm. Right? Pretty trivially true. So the catch is to try to figure out who are these people that care more about norms. How can we measure this? Well, so this project started actually walking home from a pub in the Netherlands. I was at Maastricht University for a year. And we were coming back about 2 in the morning and remarking on the way home, my co-author on the original paper is Russian, I'm American. We were remarking about the Dutch and German students who would stop and wait at the walking stoplights at 2 in the morning, even though there were no cars around, nobody there to punish them, no danger, and yet they were waiting. We were laughing. What does that tell you about someone? So we thought, well, maybe it tells you a lot. So we designed a simple task where people control a little stick figure. The stick figure walks across the screen, comes to a series of stoplights, automatically stops. There's a button at the bottom of the screen that says walk, and they can click that button at any point in time to restart. We tell them the rule is to wait until the light turns green. So that's just an innocuous phrase in the instructions. The catch is that time is money in this setting. So they start with an endowment of money, but that endowment is ticking down the longer it takes them to get across the screen. So if they were to rush straight across and not wait at any of the stoplights, they would lose only €2 for about 25 seconds of their time. Each light is red for 5 seconds before it turns green, so you're going to double that cost if you waited all the lights. So just 30 seconds of time, €2 difference. And what we're going to do is measure how long people spend waiting at those lights, and think of that as a measure of this intrinsic preference for following rules and norms. You might say, well, that's just an experimenter demand effect. I prefer the other interpretation, but actually, if you really want it, an experimenter demand effect is an instance of this kind of norm following. Why else would they follow? Why should they care about my demand if they aren't interested in trying to satisfy the norm of, when you're in an authority relationship, you listen to the authority. When the person in the white lab coat tells you to do something, you do. So what we're going to do is measure how long these individuals spend waiting at the light. And we think that this gives us a good idea of the heterogeneity. So however long you wait tells us something about the intensity of your preference for norm following. And then we're going to put these people in a bunch of games where we have a good idea of what the norm is, either because through intuition or because we've observed how people play these games in the past. So they're actually well-known games for studying prosocial behavior. And we're going to see, does the prediction of the model bear out? So this is a previous paper. We found evidence consistent with this hypothesis in Dictator, Ultimatum, Trust, and Public Goods games. So these are kind of, I call them like the big 4 of social preference experiments, right? And it turns out that in all these games, how long you spend waiting at these lights is going to turn out to be correlated with your behavior in interesting ways. And so first, just let me show you the distribution of rule following. So we have one treatment where the rule is in the instructions. Huge numbers of people wait exactly the amount of time that we tell them to. So invoking this rule worked. There are some people who don't wait, but very many people wait the whole time. In fact, almost 2/3 of the sample wait at least 25 seconds. There's 1 or 2 people that wait a very long time. I'm not sure what they're doing. Yeah, maybe they fell asleep. We also have a treatment to make sure, to what extent is it something about this context that we've induced by having the stoplight task. Maybe they believe that there's some risk to breaking the rule, that there's a punishment that we haven't stated or something like that. So we just get rid of the statement that the rule is in the instructions. We still see some people waiting. So clearly that context is inducing it, but a much bigger effect is of us just telling them that this is the rule in this setting. So here's the data from all those games. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but when we sort people according to their waiting times into groups of what we call rule followers and groups of rule breakers, the rule followers sustain high contributions over time, while the rule breakers show the typical declining pattern in a public goods game. This is a voluntary contribution public goods game. This is percentiles. As you move right along this axis, you're looking at percentiles of the rule following distribution. So here I'm comparing the upper 35th percentile of waiting times to the lower 35th percentile of waiting times and saying how much did they give in the Dictator game. The people who wait longer give more in the Dictator game. They set higher rejection thresholds in the Ultimatum game, so they are, lower. They're less willing to accept low offers in an Ultimatum game, although there is no difference in the amount that they send. Okay, anyway, the point of this figure is to show you we have a lot of evidence from different games that this seems to do a good job explaining their behavior, that rule-following preferences explain prosocial behavior in games where we know the norm. As we've gone through the, well, I'll come back to that actually. So one concern with this task, as I said before, this is actually the new part of the research, is that this task might be noisy because people are worried that their little man's going to get hit by a car. It's not going to be very portable across. But the point is that there are reasons other than pure rule-following preference that someone might want to follow the rule in that setting. So now that we know that it worked, that just telling them to follow a rule was effective, we decided maybe we can come up with a more arbitrary rule-following task, something that's culture-free that would port well across societies. I have dreams of running these everywhere. And so we came up with this. It's 2 buckets. You have 100 balls that you have to allocate between 2 buckets. The return in the yellow bucket is 10 cents per ball. The return in the blue bucket is 5 cents per ball. We say the rule is to put the balls in the blue bucket. Very simple. The rule is to take the lower return, so it's just pure demand, right? Well, it turns out and then we're going to test this in a Dictator game. We're going to compare behavior in the Dictator game. That was where we got some of the most robust results in the first paper, so we said we'll just follow up and make sure this thing works. So we're going to do a Dictator game in a very similar way. There's 100 balls. You have to allocate them to yourself and the other person. You drag them one by one. Each ball is worth 15 cents, so they're dividing up $15. Here they had 100, so the difference was between earning $10 or $5 if you broke the rule completely or followed the rule completely. Well, so here's the distribution of rule following. These are people who didn't follow the rule at all. These are people who followed the rule completely. There's a little bit in between. So we got this really nice separation of types with the new task. Much starker, more people in the low end. This is the distribution of Dictator giving, which fortunately looks pretty similar to what you typically see in Dictator games, so this new way of doing it didn't seem to screw things up. And the correlation between how long you wait and how much you give is even higher in this version than it was in the other one. So we like this new task. The idea that it will be portable and those kinds of things are also benefits, but it seems to work even better. Okay, so then the next step, the other implication of this model of norm-following preference is that if it's true that manipulations of context change norms associated with the games, then who should be sensitive to those changes in context? Well, it's only the guys who care about norms. You shouldn't expect rule followers to behave differently, rule breakers to behave differently when you change the context because they're just the selfish payoff maximizers anyway. But the people who care about norms should have their behavior influenced by changes in context. So in that, what we need to do then is know what the norm is in games and try to use context manipulations to change the norm. So we borrowed a very nice task from Krupka and Weber's paper in 2013, where they use a coordination game to elicit beliefs about the appropriate thing to do in a given situation. So this is just taking that Dictator game that I just described to you, saying, imagine there's a person playing that game. Now I'm going to give you a list of actions that that person could take, and I want you to tell me whether each of those actions is very socially inappropriate, somewhat socially inappropriate, somewhat socially appropriate, very socially appropriate. The catch is we're going to draw one of these at random, and you only get paid if your answer corresponds to the answer that the most other people gave in your group. So why does this work for eliciting norms? Well, it captures that idea nicely that a norm is a set of shared beliefs. So I have to think about what you're going to think is the right thing to do. That is what a norm is. It's what we all think is the right thing to do. So we're incentivizing people to report what they believe is the socially appropriate thing in each of these settings. And then we can use that. The most socially appropriate thing is the norm. Right? So here's the baseline Dictator game. Well, there's a set of classic experiments. I guess they're classics now. They're not that old. But with give and take framings of the same game. So now we're doing the same thing. Instead of these balls starting outside of the bucket, they either start all in my bucket, and then I either have to click them to keep them there, or drag them to you if I want to give them. Or they start all in your bucket, and I have to take them from you to give them to me, or I can click to keep them there. Well, so our intuition behind this was that taking is worse than not giving. This gets back to the acts of commission versus acts of omission idea. And there is some evidence from other papers that this is the case, that people rate taking as worse than not giving. So what we do is we elicit the norms in these games with the idea that, okay, we can show that the norm changes, and then we can show that the people who are sensitive to the change in norms are the people who follow the rule the most. So we're going to use same subject pool, but different subjects. We'll elicit the norms on a subset of them, and then we'll actually run the experiment on the other subset. So here is the social appropriateness rating of various allocations. What you see is that they all agree that the 50-50 split is the best thing in every case. So we didn't really shift the norm. But what it does change a little bit is how wrong it is to be selfish. So in the, we also have a give-take framing where half start in each bucket. I'll talk more about that as we get to it. So, but it does seem that there is a difference in the tails, though the norm hasn't changed. Well, then we go and run the Dictator game. And this is the give treatment, this is the take treatment, this is the give-take treatment. And I'm just splitting them at the median of the rule-following distribution for within their treatment. I'm calling everyone below the median a rule breaker, everyone above the median a rule follower. And these are cumulative distribution, empirical CDFs of the distribution of giving. And what you see is that in every one of those cases, the rule followers give more than the rule breakers. But it's slightly puzzling that in the take treatment, people are actually more selfish than in the give treatment. And this kind of goes against what we were expecting originally. So I have a couple of conjectures for why this might be the case, and I'll run them by you. One is that each ball you take, you have to take one by one. And maybe the norm is don't take at all. And once you've started taking, well, you've already violated it, so you might as well take everything. Someone told me yesterday that they had evidence for that in another setting, so I can't vouch for it entirely. Another possibility is that it's a labor cost kind of story, that, well, it's a pain in the butt to drag all these balls across, so I'm going to compensate myself a little bit more for that labor. So we're going to go back and run a chosen effort version of this rather than the real effort where you have to drag to see if that makes a difference. Regression analysis, the reason I put this up here, it's messy, but so it turns out that once you control for interesting covariates, the give-take treatment does actually seem to make people more prosocial. So that's where the balls start out half and half in each bucket. And we think that gives some credence to the labor cost story because the normative split has already been implemented for you. So all you have to do is keep the default in place to follow the norm. But another interesting thing is that we give people this moral values questionnaire that Jonathan Haidt and co-authors have developed that's supposed to measure the intensity of your concern for various moral values: harm, fairness, in-group preference, purity, and authority. And so the really interesting interaction here is with authority in the take treatment. People who think authority is a really important value, that you should respect authority, seem to be very selfish in the take treatment. The more they respect authority, the more they take when they have the power to take. So maybe there's some interesting psychological dynamics going on that we weren't anticipating with that treatment. I only have a couple minutes, right? 2 minutes. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to be very quick about this. Another cool implication of this is that frames can change the norms of games, right? So we were thinking about the ultimatum game, that it might be different depending on whether the act of the second person is perceived as one of creating a pie that doesn't exist yet, or of destroying an already existing pie. So if you think about when I'm not creating a pie, I'm not changing, like the default utility, there's 0 utility. I've not created a pie, so nobody's utility changes. But if the pie already exists and I destroy it, well, then maybe I'm subtracting utility from you when I'm doing the act of destruction. And so one of the implications we can show that with this utility specification that if it's the case that as a second mover, the pie does not yet exist, then as a first mover, I should only care about the type of the second mover. I should be really concerned about what type that person is, whether they're a rule follower or not. If it's the case that I'm actually allocating an existing pie, then my own norm-following preferences should come into play. And I'm not going to have time to explain the argument for it, but I'll show you how we do this experimentally. So the pie is a water tank, and the question is whether to fill or drain the tank. So in one treatment, the tank is empty. A specifies the division of the water. Water is money. The area of the tank is how much money they earn. And then B decides whether to fill the tank or not. In the other treatment, the tank starts out full. I propose a division, and then B can drain it or not. So we're trying to give a visual representation of this intuition that it's an act of creation or an act of destruction. Like I said, players 1 should be more concerned about the preferences of players 2 when the pie has not yet been created than in the case where the pie already exists. And what that means is we should expect to see more 50-50 offers or splits that favor player 2 when the pie doesn't exist yet, so in the empty tank treatment. And here are the histograms of giving, and what we do see is a lot more clustering at 0 in that case. Sorry, at the 50-50 split in that case. This is a more diffuse distribution. So we do get some evidence in favor of this. I should sum up. So why do I like this? Well, I think thinking about it in terms of norms allows us to explain these context effects that otherwise seem somewhat mysterious. And we can do it in a way that's pretty simple. I like simple. So different contexts activate different normative benchmarks, and that explains why behavior changes across these contexts. It's not irrational in any sense. It's just a fact that the norm changed, and so my behavior changed because I care about following norms. The other thing is that we can still capture the heterogeneity because there's heterogeneity in the intensity of this preference across individuals. So that explains why some people are more affected by these changes than others. I think it can also potentially explain cross-cultural differences that have seemed somewhat mysterious without making an argument that people just have different preferences for the utility of others across culture. What it is that the same situation may evoke a different norm for people who've been raised in a different culture, right? So they come to the game and everyone is presented with the same scenario, but they interpret it differently. It induces a different norm, and that might help explain why we observe these differences. And I want to say that I don't think of this as purely destructive of social preference. I'm out of time. Okay. Well, it's not destructive. The social preference model can be embedded in the framework.
Any questions? We have 2 minutes.
What was the last 30 seconds of your talk?
Okay, so very briefly, I think that anytime you specify a particular model of social preferences, you're implicitly embedding a norm in the utility function. So if you have inequality-averse guys, then those guys are always going to apply the norm of equity to every situation. If you have reciprocity in your model, then you're always going to apply the norm of reciprocity to every situation. The reason those models are sometimes going to fail is because the wrong norm is being applied to the situation. It's not because that norm doesn't sometimes work to explain behavior. It's that you've imported the wrong thing for that particular set.
Okay, one more question.
More of a comment than anything else, but since you talked about sort of this cognitive cost of taking, if you look at the Bolinian paper that John List has, you get basically that same result. They don't talk about it in that way, but when you can take $1 from somebody else, is like a limit. The decision, how much you share, is spikes at 0. So there's not a lot of people taking $1. But it's all concentrated at 0. When you let them take up to $5, it's all concentrated taking 5.
Oh, okay.
So it's sort of fit that pattern of, if I'm going to cross over the dark side and take money, I'm not going to do it for $1.
Yeah.
Right? But I will do it for 5.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.